Sup, chooms? How y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, in my last video, I went over many subjects, but the one I thought was the most important was the segment about scalp massages and Blutflow, because based on the reception, it seems a lot of people, specifically followers of Rob English, are still convinced that the Blutflow theory is a legitimate theory and scalp massages are a viable treatment for hair loss, and there were a lot of comments in the last video trying to defend it. I'm not here to bash people for believing in the Blutflow theory. 10 years ago, I probably would have fallen for it too, but the fact is that scalp massages and all the theories based around how it works, including the blood flow theory, are completely false. I've talked about this a lot on my channel, and a lot of my viewers already agree with me, but if you're still skeptical, or if you're new to this channel, I'd ask that you give me just a moment of your time and put any negative opinion you may have about me aside just momentarily, and give me the chance to explain in depth why the theories behind scalp massages for hair loss are completely bogus, and why, despite the fact that these theories have many proponents and believers, these are actually completely false theories, and in fact, they are entirely useless when it comes to treating hair loss. So, what I want to do here is go over these theories and common arguments behind why scalp massages work, and then I'm going to be using evidence-based data to explain why these theories, even if they are interesting, are still completely invalid. I'm doing this because snake oil salesmen have long promoted gimmicks that claim to improve hair growth by promoting blood flow to the scalp, and you can even see ads for such products dating back to the 19th century. Here are some examples.
And I'll take you to the circus.
All right, Cyrus, that will be some treat.
Just hold tight to my arm and don't get nervous.
Don't forget to get a treat.
Notice that many of these advertisements mention poor blood circulation as being a causation of hair loss, and that using their products will apparently improve circulation and thus stop hair loss. So these gimmicks have been promoted by snake oil salesmen and hairline fraud cells for over a century. What's unfortunate is all these hairline fraud cells and grifters still exist today. The only real difference between now and back then is that instead of having names like Cervax, Carbo Magno, Evans Vacuum Cap, etc., they now go by names like HairGuard, Adagen, or Perfect Hair Health. And even though the presentation of their services has become more slick and modernized, the truth is that they're every bit as scamful as the snake oil salesmen of old. Now, usually the biggest rationale that's used to justify scalp massages relates to the Blutflow theory, though more recently, as the evidence against this theory has become overwhelming, the scalp massage proponents have moved the goalpost to other speculative theories like scalp stretching and effects on inflammation, but many people still cling to the Blutflow theory, so let's examine this ancient dead mummy of a theory that has been brought back to life and whose shambling corpse continues to haunt the hallways of legitimate hair loss research. So, before the androgen hypothesis was established and verified, the prevailing theory behind what causes hair loss was poor circulation to the scalp. Obviously, the tissues of the human organism require blood in order to survive, so if blood flow is impaired, this can cause the hair to fall out. Makes sense, right? In fact, there is an example of this happening in people who have peripheral vascular disease in their legs. These people can lose hair in their feet and legs due to impaired circulation, and this has long been medically documented. So even though it turns out this phenomenon does not apply to the scalp, which has a very different form of circulation than the legs, it is easy to see why early medical researchers may have hypothesized that poor circulation of the scalp was causing hair loss. Anyways, this old theory takes this concept behind peripheral vascular disease and it applies it to the scalp by proposing that blood flow is impaired in the scalp because of scalp tension or muscle contraction impinging on the blood vessels, thus restricting flow of blood into the hair follicles, which would cause the hair to eventually die due to lack of oxygen and nutrients from the blood. This claim was further supported by the idea that the areas of the greatest scalp tension correlated with the areas most commonly associated with hair loss, and this is partly true, as you can see here. But keep in mind that this figure is from just a computer simulation of scalp tension, and I'll address this a bit later in this video, but for now, just know that from the onset, it does look like there is indeed a correlation that resembles the common pattern of hair loss that we see from charts like the Hamilton-Norwood scale, which measure male pattern baldness. So, like I said, the old theory behind hair loss was due to the idea of blood flow restriction, but even back then, people knew that there had to be some other factor involved. Even Socrates in ancient Greece made note of the fact that it was curious how eunuchs who were castrated before puberty never went bald. So even back then in ancient Greece, people knew that there was likely an androgenic role in hair loss. It's just that they didn't have the scientific tools to measure things like hormones and their effects on hair follicles. Once we fast forward to the 20th century though, scientific discoveries led to the realization that the fundamental reason why people with male pattern baldness go bald is because of the presence of DHT on the scalp. This was verified with research which eventually led to the development of finasteride based on similar observations to what Socrates observed, namely that populations of people with low 5-AR activity never go bald, and since 5-AR is the enzyme that converts testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, DHT, we know that the 5-AR enzyme is the culprit responsible for the progression of androgenic alopecia. This is what is popularly known as the androgen hypothesis, and it is further reinforced by the fact that people with the androgenic alopecia gene have greater 5-AR expression in the scalp and thus more DHT, as well as an increased sensitivity to DHT in their hair follicles. In addition to this, genetic research has shown that androgenic alopecia tends to run in families and that there are over 250 genes involved in the genesis of androgenic alopecia. Thus, it appears in fact that in people who are susceptible to androgenic alopecia, the hairs on the vertex of the scalp are pre-programmed genetically to be more sensitive to DHT and have also a higher 5-AR affinity than other hairs in the body, which is ultimately what causes hair loss in the patterns we typically associate with pattern hair loss as seen in the Norwood-Hamilton scale. This is the research that has led to the development of Proscar, which is finasteride prescribed at 5 milligrams for enlarged prostate, since DHT is also responsible for enlarging the prostate. A few years later, it was released in a smaller 1 milligram dose tablet known as Propecia for the treatment of male pattern baldness, and since then, it has saved the hair follicles and confidence of millions of men, and even today, nearly 25 years after Propecia first hit the market, finasteride has remained the gold standard for treating androgenic alopecia since it targets the 5-AR enzyme which prevents the buildup of DHT on the scalp. So, after the androgen hypothesis was confirmed, what happened to the blood flow theory and treatments like scalp massages, you may ask? Well, you'd think that all the grifters and hairline fraud cells who promoted the theory would be out of the job, right? Well, as it turns out, they're still around. They've just managed to change their messaging to incorporate the androgen hypothesis into their own debunked theory in order to give it the veneer of legitimacy, and they use just enough science to make their claims seem believable. So, what proponents of the blood flow theory will do today is they'll say, actually, the blood flow theory is directly linked to the androgen hypothesis, and this is based on the genesis of DHT is dependent on the presence of oxygen in the blood. With a lack of oxygen, testosterone is more likely to convert into DHT and thus destroy your hair. But in the presence of oxygen, testosterone is more likely to aromatize into estrogen, which is benign or possibly even beneficial for the hair. Combine that with the fact that the areas of greatest scalp tension correlate with the areas we often associate with pattern hair loss, and the fact that the oxygen levels in bald scalps were lower than in scalps with normal amounts of hair, then the theory so far on paper seems pretty sound, right? There's only one tiny little problem though, and that's the fact that all these observations don't support the blood flow theory at all, and the blood flow theory is complete bullshit. It is easy to see why people who are new to the good fight against hair loss would fall prey to this kind of deceptive cherry picking of scientific research, so let's go into all the claims made about the blood flow theory and why devices like the Grow Band or techniques like scalp massages that allegedly work by improving blood flow to the scalp are not just wrong wrong in practice, but they're even wrong in theory. Even mechanistically, the theory is completely bunk. So let's first look at the study most often cited to try to justify the link between the Blutflug theory and hair loss. To reiterate, bald men have lower blood supply to the scalp than men who have hair. Therefore, this must be some evidence that bald men are at least in part losing their hair due to poor blood supply, and therefore we can promote hair growth through practices that improve blood supply to the scalp, like scalp massages. The biggest problem with this hypothesis, though, is that it ignores the more obvious explanation for this finding, and that is that it is the lack of hair follicles themselves which is what is lowering the blood flow to the scalp, rather than low blood supply decreasing the number of hair follicles. Our hair follicles are their own individual organs with their own vascular network and capillary beds. When DHT destroys hair follicles, it sets off a chain of events that also destroy the capillaries that feed blood directly into the hair follicles until eventually the hair follicles die and both the follicles and capillaries are replaced by scar tissue. Scar tissue is relatively avascular, which means it doesn't need much blood in order to survive compared to a healthy scalp with hairs. So areas of scar tissue always have lower blood flow and lower oxygen levels than healthy scalp tissues. So the reason why men who are going bald have less blood supply in their scalp is due to there being fewer capillary beds present in the scalps due to there no longer being a need to supply blood to hair follicles which have already died as a consequence of androgenic alopecia. So low blood supply in the scalp is not a cause of androgenic alopecia, but rather a consequence of it. This is an example of a correlation does not equal causation fallacy. Just because bald scalps have a lower blood supply to the scalp does not prove a causal role in the development of androgenic alopecia. It is a consequence of hair loss, as fewer hair follicles mean fewer capillaries, and therefore there is no need for that extra blood to keep your hair follicles alive. This, however, is just the start of the Blutflug theory's problems, though. For example, let's go ahead and just assume that the decreased blood flow comes first, and that causes the hair follicles to subsequently die off. Wouldn't scalp massage help that? I mean, we already said that poor circulation in the legs can cause hair follicles to die, so is there any evidence that people lose hair in their scalp as a consequence of low blood flow? And even if scalp massages could increase blood flow, would it matter at all? The theory behind scalp massages and the Blutflug theory is that tight scalp tension from the muscles surrounding the Gallia aponeurotica are clamping down on the blood vessels which supply blood to the scalp, which is depriving the hair follicles of oxygen and increasing the rate of DHT production. By physically manipulating the muscles surrounding the Gallia aponeurotica, we can relieve the scalp tension and allow greater blood supply and oxygen to enter the scalp to lower DHT and thus stop hair loss. The problem with this, though, is that anatomically it doesn't make any sense. First of all, the scalp is one of the most vascular parts of the body, and there are 12 arteries, 6 on each side of the scalp, that supply blood to the scalp. Since all these arteries are interconnected, as you can see here, this means that no artery is dependent on the other. In other words, even if one artery were completely blocked up, it would just increase blood pressure in one of the other arteries, so the overall blood supply in the scalp would remain unchanged. So take, for example, just one of these arteries, the superficial temporal artery. This artery runs along the sides of the head and is even visible in many people. In some people, it is so prominent and tortuous that people will seek cosmetic surgery to get rid of this unsightly artery. So there is this cosmetic surgical procedure that actually ligates this artery, which means they tie it off completely. So if the blood flow theory were correct, this procedure would result in hair loss on at least one side of the head, since you are completely blocking an artery that supplies blood to one side of the scalp. Well, guess what? Plastic surgeons in their experience note that this does not happen, as you can see on the website of one of these surgeons right here. This makes sense because if you were to get rid of one of the 6 arteries, the other arteries can easily compensate for it, since we know that the arteries are interconnected and thus not dependent on each other. To further demonstrate just how flawed this theory is, though, the idea that muscles can clamp down on the arteries and restrict blood flow, as proponents of the blood flow theory claim, this is physiologically inaccurate and impossible because the blood vessels are located in the fascia, which is the connective tissue that lays on top of the muscles and this layer is just under the skin layer. So in this figure, which shows the course of the superficial temporal artery, the skin is labeled 2. The superficial fascia layer is labeled 14 and is just under the skin, and the muscles are labeled 10 and 11. The artery is red and labeled 4. So it's easy to see that the artery is located above the muscles and just below the skin layer. This other figure is looking at the layers on top of the scalp where there are no muscles, and again, you can see the blood vessels run in the subcutaneous tissues just beneath the skin and above the muscles, and aponeurosis, which is just another name for the Gallia aponeurotica. Here is an even more close-up picture showing the blood vessels above the Gallia aponeurotica and just below the skin. In fact, the blood vessels are running in a layer that is full of adipose tissue, which is a very loose tissue, which allows the blood vessel to expand and contract as it's needed. So if the muscles are tight or the Gallia aponeurotica is tight, remember that the arteries are actually above these layers and so will not be compressed by these other layers. The blood vessels which supply blood to the scalp do not run through or under the muscles, and in fact, you can even see them on people underneath their skin, like I just said. So if you are interested in seeing how superficial these arteries are, I will link a video below showing the dissection of these arteries, but trigger warning, it is a bit bloody. So simply put, the notion that tight muscles can clamp down and block arteries is not anatomically possible, and even if it were possible, there are enough redundant and interconnected arteries on the scalp to compensate for this. Remember, you can even tie off one of the arteries and it doesn't cause hair loss. In general, blood vessels in the body are not inhibited by external structures. Otherwise, tissues would become necrotic and die off. If there was a significant limitation of blood flow to the scalp, it wouldn't just be the hair follicles that would be affected. The skin itself would become necrotic and slough off, and this is never seen in patients who have androgenetic alopecia because the blood supply to the scalp is always adequate for the needs of the tissues of the scalp. Now, this is not to suggest that the muscles of the head never get tense, and in fact, muscle tension in the head is what causes headaches in most people, but people aren't typically walking around with headaches 24 hours a day, so there's really not much evidence that muscle tension in the scalp is very common to begin with. And even if it were, we've already established that anatomically, this muscle tension does not interfere with blood flow to the scalp, since the vascular network isn't impinged by this muscle tension. So even though we've already established how anatomically the blood flow theory doesn't make any sense, grifters and hairline fraud cells have tried to latch onto the blood flow theory by citing studies regarding Botox use showing hair growth as evidence that Botox's muscle relaxation properties that reduce muscle tension will improve blood flow and thus increase hair growth. The problem with this, though, is that Botox is not just a muscle relaxer. Botox has been shown to have a mild hair growth stimulating effect due to its effect on suppressing negative growth factors like TGF-beta1. This was established by researchers who, instead of injecting the Botox intramuscularly, injected it intradermally. Not only did they still see enhanced hair growth, but they also demonstrated a reduction in the levels of the negative growth factor TGF-beta1. The authors of the study felt that the results of the previous Botox studies could be explained by diffusion of injected Botox and the effect of TGF-beta1 rather than the Botox effects on muscle relaxation. So even though the magnitude of the intradermal effects was less than what was seen in the intramuscular studies, it is not statistically sound to compare these studies together, which use different methodologies, different patient populations, and different sample sizes. Since we already have strong evidence against the blood flow theory as it is much more likely that Botox affects hair growth via this hormonal mechanism rather than through muscle relaxation. So, grifters have since realized that the simplistic blood flow theory has fallen apart completely, and more people are starting to realize that it is complete bro science. So realizing this, they have come up with new strategies to shift the narrative away from the blood flow theory, and they proposed another theory that will still allow them to sell their scalp massage programs. This theory is that there is something about scalp tension itself that inhibits growth independent of its effects on blood flow, or that maybe scalp massaging has some mechanism not related to blood flow that still causes benefits. Like, who knows, maybe it is linked to reducing inflammation on the scalp, or promoting growth factors, or some other bro science nonsense from the Whole Foods book section that somebody read about one day. Anyways, looking first at scalp tension, let's get back to the pattern of scalp tension that I mentioned before. This figure you see right here is commonly referenced by promoters of the scalp tension theory. It shows similarities between the patterns of tension on the scalp and the pattern of androgenetic alopecia as seen in the Hamilton-Norwood scale. This figure was generated by a computer model and stress patterns predicted to occur in the scalp. This is not from actual measurements of tension in real human scalps, and as such, this is a highly theoretical model, and in fact, the authors admit that they used a two-dimensional model, whereas the scalp is of a three-dimensional proportion. So whether this model has anything to do with reality is questionable to begin with. So there really is no hard data that proves that this pattern of scalp tension really matches what is going on in a real scalp. And even if it does, this would just be a correlation and not a causation. And even with the correlation, it isn't entirely accurate. The reason why people lose hairs in patterns like we see in the Hamilton-Norwood scale is based on genetic determinism. The majority of people who inherit the androgenetic alopecia gene will have genetically greater 5-AR expression, more androgen receptor activities on the hair follicles, and thus also a greater genetic sensitivity to DHT in patterns associated with the Norwood scales that we associate with male pattern baldness. However, this is not always the case. There are people who have androgenetic alopecia who will lose hairs in diffuse patterns, as we commonly see with female pattern hair loss, although this diffuse pattern can affect men as well. We also see cases of retrograde alopecia, where paradoxically to the scalp tension theory, people will lose hair first in the areas of low scalp tension, such as the occipital region. These are not common causes of androgenetic alopecia, but they are still cases of androgenetic alopecia that can be effectively treated with the use of a 5-AR inhibitor like finasteride. So, it is obvious that the incidence of pattern hair loss is due to genetic determinism, and just because the most common pattern of hair loss correlates with areas of scalp tension does not mean scalp tension has anything to do with hair loss, especially since we see exceptions where people lose hair in areas of low scalp tension first, which is where hair is usually harvested for hair transplant surgery, which leads me to my next point. If scalp tension of the Gallia apoderatica were implicated in the progression of androgenetic alopecia, then why is it that hair transplants work? The science behind hair transplant surgeries was first established by Dr. Orentreich in a study he conducted in 1959. Back then, keep in mind the whole scalp tension thing was still taken seriously by the scientific community. So, in order to test this theory, what Dr. Orentreich did was he harvested hairs from the occipital region of the scalp and transplanted them to the front of the scalp and performed one of the first hair transplant surgeries. What he noticed was that the hair follicles didn't miniaturize despite being in an area of high scalp tension. To further test this theory, Dr. Orentreich performed the opposite experiment, where he took a hair that was miniaturized on the front of the scalp and then transplanted it to an area of low tension on the arm, and despite being in an area of low tension, the hair follicle still miniaturized at the same rate. This research was further confirmed in 1979 by a Dr. Nordstrom, where he took hair from the top of the scalp from subjects with androgenetic alopecia, and he transplanted these hairs to the forearm. Guess what? They miniaturized at the same rate as the hairs on the top of the head, thus proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that blood flow and scalp tension and all the theories that surround them are completely wrong. This is why the blood flow theory is the old theory, not the new theory. This research formed the basis for hair transplantation surgeries that many of us, including myself, benefit from today. And that is why most hair transplant surgeries are considered permanent procedures, even though a patient will still have to remain on finasteride in order to prevent the non-transplanted hairs from falling out. So, it is still worth mentioning that there are cases where transplanted hairs do miniaturize, but this is usually due to poor surgical techniques which harvest from regions outside of what is considered the donor safe zone. These mistakes can be avoided by doing proper research and finding a high-quality hair transplant surgeon and avoiding things like Turkish hair mills and other low-quality doctors. Doing proper research on good doctors through resources like the Hair Restoration Network is always critical in order to avoid these mistakes. So, At this point, it seems scalp massages wouldn't be helpful, since both the blood flow theory and the scalp tension theory have been thoroughly debunked. But I'm sure someone about right now is going to say, "But Kevin, I saw a Japanese study that proved that scalp massages work, so even if these theories aren't true, they clearly work somehow. Maybe it has something to do with growth factors." Okay, so there is a study from Japan from 2016 titled, quote, "Standardized scalp massage results in increased hair thickness by inducing stretching forces to dermal papilla cells in the subcutaneous tissue," unquote. So let's take a look at this Nobel Prize quality study. It includes a grand total of 9 healthy men who actually had normal hair. No, they did not have androgenic alopecia at all, so not exactly the best type of candidates for a study of androgenic alopecia. It would be like doing a study on the role of testosterone on pubertal development and using Jason Blaha as your subject. Anyways, these 9 subjects underwent a whole 4 minutes of scalp massages daily for 24 weeks, but they only massaged one side of the head, so the other side acted as the control group for the study. They measured hair number and hair thickness, as well as doing a bunch of biochemical and genetic analyses on the hair, but let's go ahead and see what they found. So, first, looking at hair density, the only significant change was that at 12 weeks, the massage side had a decrease in hair density, as you can see here. The massage group is in black bars, and the non-massage group is in white bars. By the end of the study, there was no difference in hair density on either side, so not too resounding of a result here. Looking at hair thickness, here is a result that the investigators are touting as showing that scalp massages really work. The difference between the hair thickness in the massage group at baseline and hair thickness in the massage group at 24 weeks was considered statistically significant. So the scalp massage at first glance looks like an improved hair thickness. However, looking at the difference in the two sides of the head at baseline, for whatever reason, the hair thickness was a lot worse on the massage side before the treatment was performed compared to the non-massage side. So these sides weren't comparable to begin with. At the end of the 24 weeks, the massage side is just catching up with the non-massage side, and strangely enough, actually the hair thickness is better on the non-massage side compared to the massage side. It looks like just for whatever reason, and with such a small number of subjects, it might have just been 1 or 2 test subjects that messed up the data. It looks like the hair cycles on the two sides were a lot different to begin with, maybe just due to chance. The hair cycles on different areas of the scalp are not all synchronized, so everyone, even people without androgenic alopecia, are going to have different rates of growth in different areas of the scalp no matter what. So they also looked at hair growth rate, and not surprisingly, scalp massage did diddly squat for hair growth. Like I said, they looked at genetic findings and found a bunch of up and down regulated genes in the two sides of the head. But gene regulation also depends on what part of the hair cycle the hairs are in, and differences could easily be explained by just random chance depending on which hairs you select for analysis. So this study is a complete nothing burger, but it is still exploited by proponents of the blood flow / scalp tension theory because so much of their bullshit has been debunked that they're now grasping for straws at this point, especially since a lot of these hairline fraud cells base their business model largely off of scalp massages, as well as the false hope that scalp massages could be used as an alternative to the pharmaceutical prevention protocols that we know work. So I know the idea of relying on a pharmaceutical treatment is scary for a lot of people, but the reality is that if you have androgenic alopecia and want to stop hair loss long term, then you have no choice but to rely on drugs that target the mechanism which we know is responsible for the progression of androgenic alopecia. That means lowering DHT on the scalp with a 5-AR inhibitor like finasteride. Now, I know that there are other theoretical treatments in the pipeline that may work by targeting the downstream effects of DHT, like the WNT Wnt pathway inhibitors I've talked about before on my channel, but the fact of the matter is that these new treatments are backed by strong scientific evidence and logical mechanisms, while the evidence behind scalp massages don't fit either of these criteria. There is zero evidence to support them, and we've established earlier that even in theory, they don't work based on their mechanism not being plausible. I know that there are always going to be people who claim that scalp massages worked for them, but you have to realize that every scam product or service that is ever existed is always going to have its series of defenders. Even Jilly Juice, which was just some disgusting fermented sewer water or something like that, made claims that it could cure everything under the sun, and there were even people there who swore it worked for them. The reality, though, is that these people who are claiming scalp massages work are likely just experiencing growth from other factors or just experiencing a placebo effect. Remember, in clinical trials for hair loss treatments, we often see growth even in the placebo group because the placebo effect is real, and also since hair growth cycles are cyclical as well as seasonal, even people who do have androgenetic alopecia can have periods of accelerated growth. So there may be other therapeutic reasons why people want to massage their scalp, like maybe for tension headaches, but if you are massaging your scalp because you think it is going to stop hair loss, then I'm sorry to say it, but you have been lied to and you are wasting your time. The people who are promoting scalp massages as viable alternatives to conventional therapies are preying upon our fear and ignorance, and when you give them your time and patronage, you are legitimizing the scams they promote. So it's important not just for yourself, but for the entire hair loss community that people do not promote these pseudoscientific gimmicks. So that's all I have to say for today, and if you are in fact new to my channel, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I hope you did learn something from it, and if you did like it, maybe take an opportunity to check out the rest of my content. Maybe you'll find something that's informative and will help you on your hair loss journey. So until next time, take care, Chooms.